Hey, juniors and seniors taking the Lit and Composition AP. It's Mr. Urioste, English Department Chair. And I'll be walking you through a series of AP videos to prep you for the AP review session we'll be having later this month on Wednesday, April 15th. That's a community day. Before you get to that review session, you'll want to view all the videos. There'll be 5 of them. This first one is going to give you a quick overview of what you can expect on the AP exam. What does the structure look like, and so on. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to, let me share a screen here. All right. When you go to the content library in your English OneNote, and that's whether you're in the Literature of Love class, the Censorship in Literature class, or the Literature of the American Dream class, doesn't matter, right? Your teacher has put in the content library near the top, I think, the Lit AP resources. And I'll be walking through all of these. And here they are. You go to this section, you've got a whole series of pages. Let's look at the first one, the overview of the Lit and Comp AP, right? First of all, it is a 3-hour test, right? And you'll spend probably about the first hour, right, working on the multiple choice. One thing I want to say is that there will not be timers there, right, letting you know how much time has gone by. It is your job to keep track of your time. So you don't want to spend 2 hours on the multiple choice, right? You want to spend about an hour. Typically, there are about 55 questions, right? It's 45% of your overall score for the AP. There tend to be 5 sets of questions, sometimes 4, but usually 5, made up of 8 to 13 questions each. Questions include excerpts from prose fiction, drama, or poetry. Drama means plays. Prose fiction, that means a selected passage from a novel, typically, and poetry means a poem. They don't expect you to have read any of that content. This is a skills-based class, so you won't probably recognize most of those selections. They're standalone pieces, and you're going to read them and answer some multiple choice questions about them, right? There will be at least, excuse me, my throat. There's going to be at least 2 prose fiction passages, which can include drama, again, something from a play, and at least 2 poetry passages. So that's the first part of the test. That's the first hour. The next hour is what's called a free response section. That would be 3 essay responses. So that's in 2 hours. What does that mean? You do the math, that's 40 minutes per essay, which sounds alarmingly fast. That is true. We will talk about that when we get to the videos on the 3 essay sections, how to quickly craft an outline in about 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then use the remaining 30, 25 minutes to just write. The AP graders are well aware that you are writing under the pressure of time, so they're not expecting the kind of polished work that you would produce if you were writing an essay over a series of days, for instance. But anyway, in this section, you're going to respond to 3 questions from the following categories. The poetry analysis section, which is reading a passage from of poetry and responding to a prompt with a thesis that you forged that presents a poetic interpretation backed by evidence. So they're giving you a prompt. We're going to look at these later in the poetry video. A prose fiction analysis, it is going to be an excerpt from a novel or an excerpt from a play. Doesn't matter. You're not expected to have seen this. Again, this is a skills-based test, not a content-driven test, right? And you'll respond to the prompt with a thesis that you're going to craft, and then you're going to present a literary interpretation backed up by evidence, quoting from the prose fiction. And then the literary argument, which is sometimes also called the open prompt. Let's take a look at that real fast. You'll be presented with a literary concept or idea and analyze how the literary concept or idea contributes to an interpretation of a literary work. You can choose one literary work from a list of about 40 provided to you, or you can cite another work or prose fiction or drama from your own reading to create an evidence-based argument that responds to the given topic. And we're going to look at this as well, right? This is the one area of the test when we get to that video on the literary argument over which you have the most control. And so there will be, again, detailed videos on each of these 3 sections. Right now, I'm just giving you a snapshot, as I said, of the overall test. 3-hour test, first hour multiple choice. The next hour is these 3 essays, right? So you'll be writing longhand on a piece of paper. You can't use a computer, and more details to come about each of these sections, right? So that's the overview, and I want to do one other thing in this video. I wanted to also cover a little bit more on the multiple choice sections, right? How do you prepare for this? Now, the AP folks are notorious for not offering that many practice tests for students to practice on online. You can always get a Princeton review or something like that, which will include more multiple choice tests. But frankly, I don't think you need to do more than a couple on your own. So I've included here for you the 2012 multiple choice test with an answer key beneath it, and then the 2004 test with an answer key beneath it, right? So the recommendation for you is before that AP test, which is on Wednesday, May 3rd, right? You should put yourself on the clock for an hour and do one of these exams, right? And then do it again for the other one, right? And the best way to practice is to go through, don't look at the answer key in advance, do the test, right? And then circle the ones you missed and go back and pinpoint why you missed the ones you missed. Why is one answer better than the one that you registered? There's going to be later some before school optional walk-in sessions where I'll be available to discuss questions you might have at the multiple choice, and I'll get you information on that later. But here are 2 practice exams that you can do between now and the test, right? And then finally, the last part of this video, I wanted to quickly cover some multiple choice test taking tips. It's the 3rd page down in this Lit AP resources section in your content library, right? So let me open this up real fast and walk you through this PowerPoint. So first of all, I've covered this before, right? It's 45% of your overall test score, 5 sets of questions made up from 8 to 13 questions each. Questions can include excerpts from prose fiction, drama, that's plays, or poetry. And each excerpt is accompanied by several multiple choice questions. Again, there'll be at least 2 prose fiction passages and at least 2 poetry passages. So that's the format. General tips. I'm going to recommend that you work in order, right? The questions vary randomly in difficulty, right? Sometimes, the 3rd passage is easier than an earlier one, right? Sometimes individual questions are harder than ones that are from the same passage, right? So work in order. It doesn't make sense for you to skip later or do the first section last, etc. Can you take notes? You can take notes on the exam booklet, right? So it is fine for you to circle words and phrases and so on, right? You definitely don't want to spend too much time on any one question, right? There's essentially you have about 12 minutes per passage, right? So you don't want to get bogged down. You can skip a question and come back to it later. Don't get bogged down on one. And then finally, if you see that a passage is long, that doesn't mean it's more difficult than the shorter passages. Sometimes a short poem can be trickier than a longer prose passage, for instance. A couple other general tips. Don't fight the question or the passage. In other words, by that I mean, you don't need to worry about what you know about the subject, right? What do I know about this author, right? What do I know about, do I know any background to this, right? All that you need to know is provided in the test prompt, right? If there's any dates or any kind of asterisks for some of the information, that'll be provided. So you don't need to worry about what more you know. The passage itself is all you need to look at, right? Consider obviously all the choices that are given, right? And keep an open mind. Sometimes later questions will contradict an answer to a previous one, so reconsider those questions if that happens. A few more general tips. Remember that when you're doing multiple choice, all parts of the answer must be correct, right? If just part of the answer is correct and one part is incorrect, that is not the right answer, right? When you have doubts about the answer, right, you can always go back to the text, right, to get the support. All of the questions given can be textually supported in one way or another. And a lot of times they'll give you a date or intro info on the passage for historical context. Not always, but sometimes they do. That information is there for a reason. It can oftentimes help you better understand the passage. So do be aware of that. let's keep going. What kinds of questions? Overall reading comprehension questions, right? Do you understand the passage? And when we break that down, there are questions about inference, right? What does the passage imply? So what inference, what meaning can you glean from it? It doesn't necessarily state meaning outright, but it implies it. And that's what literature does, right? When we interpret literature, when we pull out meaning, we're inferring meaning by interpreting a passage. They're going to ask that you identify and interpret figurative language sometimes, right? And I've got a handout later on figurative language, part of the resources for you. Literary techniques like point of view, right? That could be included. Character analysis. This is the stuff that we do in English classes, so none of this should be new for you, right? Overall passage questions, when they say the overall meaning of the passage, to see if you comprehend the overall gist thematically or in terms of a character. And oftentimes, in contrast to that, you have these line-specific questions where they ask about the meaning to a particular line, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. Sometimes they give you questions about the structure of the overall poem or prose passage, and occasionally there'll be some grammar nuts and bolts questions, right? And you'll see those in those practice tests that I included. All of these kinds of questions are included. Finally, format of questions, right? Sometimes you get those annoying questions with Roman numeral answer choices, right? Is the answer 1 and 2 only, 1 and 3 only, 1 and 4 only, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, those can be annoying, right? But you'll see what that looks like when you take the test, and then you remember all parts of the answer must be correct, right? So they're kind of testing you on that there. Here's that line-specific question. They'll say about in line 18, when the narrator says, whatever the narrator says, that suggests A, B, C, D. When you get line-specific questions, remember not to just read line 18. If it says to go to line 18, read a few sentences before line 18 and a few sentences afterwards. In other words, put that specific line in the overall context of the passage. Remember that meaning derives from context. So a particular line, right, the meaning of that line is probably going to be embedded in the couple of lines before it and the couple of lines after it. So put it in that context, right? Sometimes they're going to give you definition vocab questions. In this context, what does this word mean, right? Sometimes, so check, again, the context of where that word appears in that sentence or the couple of sentences before it, right? What does that word mean? You'll get those annoying, all of the following are present in the passage except the process of elimination, right? And then sometimes you'll get some self-contained questions like identifying figurative language. Is this quote here an example of a simile or personification or et cetera, et cetera? And I'll showcase forms of figurative language to brush up on later, right? Okay, continuing. Techniques. Process of elimination is your best friend, right? Remember that when you're doing multiple choice, a lot of times you can eliminate 2 or 3 questions pretty quickly. Those are patently wrong. Cross those out, right? And often you will be limited, you know, there'll be maybe 2 left for you, right? At that point, which is the one that is most precise and most accurate, right? Substitution, fill in the blank, right? What does that mean, right? Sometimes it can help to rephrase the question, leaving a blank where the answer should go. And then you can use each of the choices to fill in the blank until you find the one that is the best fit, right? So rephrasing a question, right, can sometimes help out. Using context, of course, right? Again, those line-specific questions, what is the context for that specific line, right? The couple of lines before and after. Anticipation questions, and then sometimes you rely on intuition, educated guess, right? If you use process of elimination and get it down to 2 and you're not quite sure which is better and you're a little bit worried about the time, go with your gut at that point. This one seems a little better for me, right? And go with that. When time is running out, right? Because again, you don't want to spend more than an hour on the multiple choice. You want to have 2 hours for the 3 essays, right? Things that you can do: scan the remaining questions and look for the shortest questions or the ones that point to a line, those line-specific questions that I've talked about a couple of times. Look for questions that are about specific detail or specific definition questions. Those can sometimes be a little bit easier, right? Look for self-contained questions. For example, identifying figurative language questions. Again, they might say in this line, and they quote the line, right? What figurative languages used, right? A, B, C, D, E, right? Those can be addressed very, very quickly. And then finally, answer all of the questions when you're running out of time, right? You do not get points taken off for wrong answers, right? You get credit for what you get right. And the other thing you should know about the multiple choice section, it is at a relative scale. You are judged, right? How well you do depends on how well everyone else taking the test does, right? They actually do a statistical breakdown of each single question, right? So if you get one of question 37 right, but 75% of test takers got that wrong, that can be helpful, right? So some questions are harder than others. Answer them all, right? You're not getting any points off for the ones that you get wrong, right? You get credit for the ones that you get right. And there, the score finally. The higher multiple choice score, the less pressure you have to earn 3 high scores in the essay portion and vice versa, obviously. Your goal is to answer at least 30 questions correctly. So when you do those 2 multiple choice tests, those practice tests, that's what you're shooting for. If you do way better than that, fantastic. But you're shooting for about 30 questions correct of the between 50 and 55 questions, right? And here's a scoring calculator that you can play with later if you wish, right? And there you have it, right? So that is the overview for the multiple choice, right? Let me go back to OneNote. So we've covered here this overview, the multiple choice section, the sample test that you can look at, and then finally these test taking tips. Before you practice these 2 exams on your own before the test, because you really should do that, right? Review this PowerPoint one more time, and then again, put yourself on the clock for each of these 2 tests that you find here, right? Print it out, first of all, and just go through no more than an hour for each, and then test with the answer keys, circle the ones you got wrong, understand why you got the ones wrong, and you can follow up then with me or any English teacher in the department. We should be able to help you with that. Again, I'll let you know in advance when we'll have some drop-by sessions in the morning for these kinds of things. All right, fantastic. So let me stop the share here. And that concludes the first video. We'll move on to the poetry analysis in the next one.